Okay, guys, we're going to pick up with part two of Standard 5.2 in the last section that we went over. We talked a little bit about um, imperialism and how imperialism is going to eventually come to the United States. A couple things that you really need to understand from that last lesson was, why did the United States become involved in imperialism? You want to know what eventually leads to the Spanish American War. You want to know about what yellow journalism is. You want to make sure you know what the results were of the Spanish American War. So you want to make sure that you can answer those questions from the last lesson. So make sure that you can. Let's look at some of the stuff though that we've got left for Standard 5.2. And the first thing we're going to talk about is something known as the insular cases. What the insular cases were was something that's going to involve the Supreme Court. And of course, with all this new acquisition of land, there's going to be some issues that are going to arise. One of them, of course, from the last set of notes, how we talked about the Philippines eventually being taken over by the United States. And of course, the Filipinos eventually began to not like the idea of U.S. occupation. In fact, they started to fight back using guerrilla warfare against the U.S. troops that were stationed in the Philippines. Um, this was sometimes bloody and, of course, very violent. The insular cases, though, were, again, these were Supreme Court case that was eventually decided on involving some of these U.S. territories, and, of course, the Philippines being one of those places. And what it was that inhabitants of the U.S. territories had some, but not all, of the rights of U.S. citizens. And the Supreme Court is going to step in and eventually uphold this thing, saying that just because the U.S. flag or you're under the control of the U.S. flag does not necessarily mean that you have the same rights that are granted by the U.S. Constitution. And of course, this quote that you see here, the Constitution does not follow the flag, meaning just because you are controlled by the U.S. doesn't mean you get all the rights granted by the U.S. Constitution. Even though these places were considered U.S. territories, they didn't necessarily get all the rights that normal U.S. citizens would have. Now, the Spanish American War and the United States' approach to imperialism is definitely going to change the world perception of the United States. Of course, a lot of these new lands weren't contiguous, meaning that they didn't join the lower 48 or the North American continent. They were sort of spread out. Places like Wake and Guam and the Philippines and Cuba were all in other places. They weren't attached to the United States. So that word contiguous pretty much means not directly attached. A lot of these places were not offered statehood, and of course, it's like that even today. Puerto Rico is still considered a U.S. territory. The U.S., of course, has always been a champion of liberty, but as this imperialistic age begins to dawn for the U.S., they were starting to be viewed more like a colonial power because they were taking these places from other countries and then putting them under their control. So it wasn't necessarily a good thing, but it wasn't necessarily a bad thing too. We're going to get into that later on. The Spanish-American War is really what made the U.S. into a world power. And I know you don't hear a lot about the Spanish-American War. We mainly talk about Rev War and Civil War and World War I and World War II and those things. But the Spanish-American War is really what brought the United States to the forefront. It established them as a world power. They had a strong Navy. Remember, we discussed about how the Navy could change things. And by this point, the United States had developed a strong Navy, much like Great Britain. And of course, they were displaying that strength by having their Navy travel around and control these other places. So the United States was very visible in a lot of different parts of the world. Okay, so that is going to wrap up 5.2. Make sure you understand what the insular cases were. Make sure you understand how the perception of the United States changed under the age of imperialism, and eventually what causes the United States to become a world power. And we just said that with the Spanish-American War. Okay, you guys have a good day, and we'll pick up 5-3 coming real soon.